Okay, this week's masterclass continues to look at the names of certain things. So we've been talking about the names of different vestments and that kind of stuff. This week we're going to look at the names of all of the different, or at least most of the different vessels or instruments that the priest might use or engage with during Mass. If you think about it, just let yourself think for a minute. When you go to Mass, everything just kind of seems so normal because you're there all the time. But there's a lot of different stuff that is being used, on the altar or around the altar. A lot of different stuff that is included, and that stuff all has names, and those names I think are just helpful for us to have down. It's not essential necessarily that you know the names of everything, but again, I think just kind of in this theme of like, what do you see at Mass? It's helpful for us to know. So the main things, of course, the main two things that you're going to see during Mass are what's called the chalice. So not necessarily the cup. This is actually an interesting thing. If you remember back in 2011, if you were around the faith back then. In 2011, there was a change in translation, in the English translation of the vessel, this particular vessel of the Mass for sure, but including this particular vessel that we used during Mass. So before, when the priest was saying the Eucharistic prayer, he would say, "Take this and drink it, this is the cup of my blood." And then the translation changed to chalice. This is the chalice of my blood, the blood of the new and eternal covenant. That word is calix in Latin, calix, and that translated is chalice. So the chalice that the priest uses during Mass, and then there's a plate, a golden plate called a paten, a P-A-T-E-N, paten, which of course sometimes have different looks to them. Sometimes it is just a plain flat plate like this that holds the priest's host of the Eucharist, but other times you might see a paten that looks more like a bowl or something like that, and that is just practical in purpose so that the paten can have more hosts on it without falling off. This one clearly couldn't hold very many without the host starting to fall off or being in danger of falling off. Sometimes the paten might be a little bit bigger. Okay, a couple of really important things about these. One is the chalice and the paten. Two is that they need to be made of precious metals, or at least the parts that touch the Eucharist need to be of precious metal, so like gold or silver. I suppose there are other options, but really like gold or silver are the two primary options. Sometimes this kind of fell out of favor for a little bit in the church in some parishes, where they started to say, well, let's use glass, or let's use clay, or let's use wood, or something like that. And it's like, no, it really shouldn't be that way. In fact, the church even says if you're going to use non-precious metals, at least the part so like the inside of the chalice or the top of the paten, those need to be of precious metal. They're essentially that way. So anyway, so those are those things, the chalice and the paten. To go along with that, there are other things. So you can think of like the altar. As a base level on the altar, there is a cloth called an altar cloth, really simple name, an altar cloth. And that, so the altar, it symbolizes Christ. And it's the place of sacrifice, and Jesus is the sacrifice. So the altar symbolizes Christ, and we know that when Jesus died and they took him down from the cross, they covered him in what? In linen garments, in a linen shroud. Multiple garments, actually, at least one over his head and one over his body, if not more beyond that. And so the linen garment that goes over the altar is symbolic of a way to honor Christ, as well as symbolic of that linen garment that covered him after he had been taken down from the cross. So that's the altar cloth. On top of the altar cloth, you're going to see the priest unfold another cloth called a corporal. So a corporal, again, is another linen garment, linen cloth that is unfolded, that is smaller than the altar. It just kind of occupies like a square space on the altar. Sometimes they might be a little bit bigger if you use like multiple chalices to distribute the precious blood or something like that. But typically they're going to be something that is unfolded, that then when the priest places the chalice and the paten on the altar, or if there's multiple patens and multiple chalices, he's going to place them all on the corporal. And the corporal, so that comes from the word corpus in Latin, which just means body. And the ideal of the corporal is what? It is to catch any crumbs that might fall from the paten, from the Eucharist. So the whole concept here of the Eucharist, and it's not a concept, but like the whole thing of the Eucharist is that it is the most sublime food that we have. And being that, we don't want to let it go to waste. There's a scene in the Gospels, all four Gospels, where Jesus feeds thousands of people with just a little bit of bread and some fish. And at the end, he says, collect all of the bread left over. And so it says they collect 12 wicker baskets full. But Jesus says, collect it so that none may be wasted. He doesn't want any of this miraculous food to go to waste. So much more in the Eucharist with this super miraculous bread that he gives us that changes into his body, blood, soul, and divinity. He does not want that to go to waste. And so we use a corporal as a way to catch any crumbs that might fall from the altar, or from the paten. So that if they fall, at the end, the priest can fold up the corporal so that they can be preserved and then properly purified. Sometimes you might see the priest leave the corporal on the altar. That's not what's supposed to happen. You got to choose your battles, but that's definitely not what's supposed to happen. Okay, so anyway, so that's the corporal. Another linen thing that you might see is called a purificator. And when the priest drinks from the chalice, and for that matter, if the chalice is distributed to others, anytime someone drinks from it, you will just take the purificator and wipe the chalice. Purificare just means to cleanse. And the idea, again, here is that no drops of the precious blood would drop to the ground, but that they would all be caught or purified by the purificator. And again, it's not like there frequently are crumbs or there frequently are drops of the precious blood, but the church is just going out of her way to care, to guard for the sacrament, the Blessed Sacrament, so that nothing is wasted. So there's that. Okay, while the priest is praying the Eucharistic prayer, or when he puts the chalice on the altar, you might see him have another thing, a square utensil, I guess we could call it, which is just called a Pall, P-A-L-L. And this is incredibly practical in purpose, which is just that. So it's got this like plastic thing that is inserted within it. So I could take it out, but it gets caught. Anyway, and the whole thing here is that you put the Pall on top of the chalice so as to keep like bugs and dust or whatever from falling into the sacred species of the body and blood of Jesus, of the precious blood of Jesus. So anyway, so that's a very practical purpose that is there for it, and yet very important. If you have, like where I live, we're just about to enter into fly season, where there's flies all over the place. And you want to have a Pall so that no flies just suddenly decide to land inside of the chalice in the precious blood, so that the priest doesn't have to drink the fly. You don't want to do that. Okay, so that's that. When the priest pours the water and the wine into the chalice, you might see him use something called a cruet or cruets, a set of cruets. And cruets are anything that you might just use as like small little pouring vessels, something like that, or have like a traveling mass kit. And my traveling mass kit has a cruet that looks kind of like this, which is just like a little bottle that can be used to pour in the wine and the water into the chalice. We'll talk about what that symbolic stuff is later on in our Catholic Masterclass. But anyway, so the cruets that the priest uses that hold both the water and the wine. Then there's something called an altar cross or an altar crucifix, and that is usually placed on the altar facing the priest. So almost always in the sanctuary, there's going to be a crucifix that is facing the people. And this is, again, presuming that the priest is not facing the same direction as everybody. But if that's the case, there's a crucifix that's already facing the people so that they can look at the crucifix. Then the priest needs to have a crucifix to look at. And so usually they'll put the crucifix on the altar facing the priest, so that during the Mass, if he wants to look up at the image of Jesus being crucified, he can do so, which might help him to enter into prayer in a deeper way. So there's that altar crucifix. And again, those sometimes might be flat, that lay flat on the altar. Sometimes they might stand up on the altar, something like that. But anyway, an altar crucifix there. Of course, if the priest is facing the same direction as everybody, ad orientem, we call that. You can go back and listen to that session. Then the altar crucifix would face the same direction, would face the people as well as the priest who is offering the sacrifice on their behalf. Okay, now we get into some optional things. So optional thing number one is called a chalice veil. And this is a veil that would go over the top of the chalice and the paten prior to them being placed on the altar and after they are finished being used on the altar. Again, if you can remember the different times I've spoken about veiling, you use veils to signify the dignity of the thing that is being used, the honor, to honor the thing that is being used. And so if you, back in Jewish times, they put a veil over like the Ark of the Covenant, over the altar, those kinds of things. So too, in the Catholic tradition, there's a tradition of using veils to cover the sacred objects, the sacred vessels that are used for Holy Mass. So that could be something. And a lot of times the veils are different colors matching the liturgical seasons. Not always, but a lot of times that's the case. Although they're still not even used all that often. But when they are used, you might see that. Then there's something called a burse. And a burse is just a compartment that you can put the corporal into, so that when the priest is done using the corporal and he's folded it up, or before he puts it on the altar, but when he's done, he's folded up, you can put it into the burse, again, as a way to honor the linen that might hold particles of the body and blood of Jesus, so that they can later on be purified, and also to kind of protect them in this object that is used. Okay, so the veil and the burse. Then there is another thing that is used outside of the context of Mass, and that is called a monstrance. So monstrance comes from the Latin word monstrare, which means to show. So the Eucharist is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus all the time. Not just like during Mass, and then when we're done, it turns back into bread and wine. No, the entire time, from the moment it is consecrated until the moment it is consumed or it decomposes, it is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus. And so there's a great tradition, actually, that has developed out of the tradition of praying before the Eucharist, which can happen in the tabernacle, where the Eucharist is reserved. But it can also happen by way of exposing the Eucharist in this monstrance through this window. So you take a Eucharistic host and put it into this little compartment there, and the Eucharist then can be visible, so that I can stare at the Eucharist and adore Jesus in the Holy Sacrament of the Eucharist. And it can be something that is very beautiful, something very powerful to do in a church, just to pray alone and with the Lord. So that's another thing that needs to be made of precious metal, gold or silver, usually. Okay, one last thing, I forgot about this, just a really simple thing. It's called a lavabo towel. When the priest washes his hands, he uses just a simple towel. Lavabo means to wash. And so anyway, there's that. Just wanted to throw that in there. I know it's in my little graph thing that I made, so I wanted to make sure I mentioned that. Okay, I hope that's helpful for you. Again, it's not super essential that you remember all these things, but it might be helpful that you remember them, so that when I refer to them in future sessions or something like that, you might have an understanding of what exactly I'm talking about. It's also just kind of neat to hear the names of these things and the purposes and the origins behind them. So anyway, I'll look forward to seeing you next week. God bless you.